Thank you, Hillel, for your kind words and for organizing and moderating this gathering in such an exemplary fashion. My appreciation to Ambassador Flores and Honduras, and also to Estonia and Ukraine for being the supporting states for this very compelling occasion. And I want to join my colleagues, and I have to say that I found their testimony moving, compelling, and enormously impactful. And so I'm privileged to join them in the common cause which brings us together, to secure justice for the Venezuelan people and accountability for the human rights violators, for Maduro and those criminally complicit with him in the ongoing, as we meet, crimes against humanity, which makes Venezuela's presence on the Human Rights Council, as it has been mentioned, as shocking as it is contemptuous of a rules-based international legal order. Close to 4 years ago, as mentioned, I was appointed by the OAS with two of my judicial colleagues from Latin America to a panel of independent legal experts, as we were characterized, to look into whether there was a reasonable basis to determine that crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela. After ongoing examination of the documentary evidence and hearing the witness testimony, we came to the determination that there was a reasonable basis to conclude that 7 major crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela, including multiple murders and extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detentions and deprivations of liberty, egregious cases of torture, rape and sexual violence, forced disappearances, political persecution underpinning these crimes against humanity, and perhaps the worst, and has been referenced, the state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering, the weaponization of food and medicine, the painful escalation of infant mortality and maternal mortality, the return of what had been diseases that had been addressed and redressed, the return of preventable diseases. And so what we had are hundreds of thousands of preventable diseases and deaths. Indeed, as all my predecessors have spoken, we're not just talking here about abstract statistics or abstract crimes. With respect to each of these crimes against humanity, there is enormous individual and familial pain and suffering, enormous assaults on the dignity and the well-being of the Venezuelan people. And so 6 months after our report, 7 countries, including Canada, made the first ever collective referral of a state party to the International Criminal Court in the history of the International Criminal Court. And more recently, after reports and investigations, as well as been mentioned by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, but more recently there was released a landmark report by the OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro and the newly appointed Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect, Jared Genzer, in which they describe in compelling detail and document that these crimes against humanity, represented in the earlier reports and findings and conclusions of law therein, had increased in scale, in scope, and severity, and that the special prosecutors in action after the initial collective referral had actually emboldened the impunity in Maduro's Venezuela. In particular, the report determined, and I have to tell you when I report this, again, bear in mind the individuals behind these horrific statistics, that there are 18,093 extrajudicial executions carried out by state security forces, 15,501 cases of arbitrary detention and deprivation of liberty, 724 cases of enforced disappearances, and these have been intensifying, particularly in the last 2 years and as we meet. 653 egregious cases of torture, and I remember Justice Manuel Robles Ventura on our panel saying these were the worst cases of torture and human suffering in that sense that he had ever seen. The weaponization of rape and sexual violence as instruments of torture. And most important, the horrific state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering, where tens of millions of Venezuelans have endured this really unfathomable human suffering because and leading to a state-orchestrated humanitarian crisis. And so, in light of all the above, in light of the compelling and moving testimony of my colleagues, what is it that we can do? What action can we take? And may I outline in one-liners, given the understanding of our audience, what are the actions that can be taken? Number one, we need to call upon the special prosecutor to expeditiously open an investigation into these crimes against humanity. As Luis Almagro mentioned, the Venezuelan regime has been enabled to operate with impunity. Two, we need to initiate a complaint under the International Court of Justice against Venezuela, which is a state party to the Torture Convention, for its egregious cases of torture. Number three, we need to initiate prosecutions on the basis of universal jurisdiction in our respective countries. Number four, we need to continue to make, and our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights has been making these representations to the working group on the disappeared, given, as I said, the dramatic increases in the disappeared as we meet. Number five, we need to invoke the United Nations special procedures, particularly the United Nations UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and the independence of the judiciary, to unmask and expose the unrelenting persecution and prosecution of Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni, who has suffered unrelenting torture at the hands of the Maduro regime, and where she is, in her case, a looking glass into the ongoing assault of the Maduro regime on the rule of law, on the independence of judiciary, and on any sense of justice in Venezuela. Number six, we should hold hearings in our respective parliaments, as we have done in Canada, to further unmask, expose, and hold accountable the Maduro criminal regime. Number seven has been mentioned, to support the petition for the suspension of Maduro's Venezuela from the UN Human Rights Council. Number eight, to enhance Magnitsky sanctions targeting the major human rights violators. And now that the European Union has adopted Magnitsky sanctions, to intensify the use of this important resource for that purpose. Number nine, to establish an inter-parliamentary alliance on Venezuela, similar to the inter-parliamentary alliance that we've established with respect to China, and to use the good offices of the Parliamentarians for Global Action, and our Wallenberg Center has entered into a partnership with them with respect to utilizing their rapid response, emergency response team for the protection of human rights defenders and parliamentarians. Number 10, and moving to a close, we need an intergovernmental alliance of the democracies to combat the axis of repression involving Iran and Russia and China which is buttressing the Maduro regime. And finally, we need to provide the desperately needed humanitarian relief to Venezuela's suffering people as we move, and this is the overall compelling theme of all our remarks, as we move to secure justice for the Venezuelan people and accountability for the criminal violators. Thank you.